Dr. Claudia Goldin, I want to start by asking you to define what the gender wage gap actually is.
Certainly. So let's talk about gender differences in pay. The first thing I want to say is that gender differences in pay have been much reduced over the long term because of many different factors. Women's education has greatly improved, their training has, and of course, I'm going back many decades. I'm not talking about the past few years. So they come to work, to the labor market, with more education, with greater credentials and training. They stay employed for longer. And in addition, many of the obvious, and I'll say man-made barriers have been removed. You might be surprised, but we used to have things called marriage bars and nepotism bans. Many remain, of course. There's still discrimination. There's still harassment. We should get rid of them. But they, will still be there to some degree, of course. But all of this means, starting where I began, that earnings of women are higher than they once were by a great amount. And this has allowed us to see what the real problems are. But you asked for me to define the gender wage gap. So let me step back and say, what do we mean by the gender wage gap? What is meant when we read, for example, that it was once 59 cents on the male dollar in 1960, and it's 83 cents, let's say, on the male dollar in 2023. So, of course, that is utterly simplistic. It is a single number, and it's produced in a very particular way. The actual gap is far, far greater, especially for more educated women. In college, graduate women, the gap is going to be much greater. That often comes as a surprise, so we can talk about that. But in addition, it's not a single number. Rather, the most important thing is what happens over the course of a lifetime. So what happens when men and women are 23 or 24 or 34 or 52? But you would like to know, what is this single number? So I will tell you what it is. It is the ratio of two separate numbers, one for women and one for men. And each is the median of the annual earnings of full-time, that's 35 hours a week or more, full-year workers. So that's how it's produced. And it's done this way to make certain that large differences in hours of work are not reflected in it. But that is how this single number is produced, and it's been produced every year by the BLS going back to around the 1960s.
So today it's around 83. It used to be around 59. So we started off talking about the fact that, listen, things have changed significantly over time, and I do want to get to that. But you did drop something that you predicted would shock me, and it did, that the gap is far greater for women who are highly educated. That shocked me. Tell me about that.
Okay, so I'm going to unshock you. What if all low-income people were at the minimum wage? What would the gap be? It would be zero. So at the very bottom, we have a floor, and it's going to be smaller, so the difference is going to be smaller. At the top, there are individuals who earn a phenomenal number of dollars a year. They're in the top tail. Those are the ones who are the college graduates and more. And so, of course, the gap is potentially greater at the top than it is at the bottom. And it's actually a lot greater at the top than at the bottom.
What creates this gender wage gap? If you take a perusal of LinkedIn or many articles where people are talking about things like, discrimination and that type of thing, But your work suggests that, yes, those things are present and real, but they actually are not the primary lever driving the gender wage gap, if I understand your work correctly. I'm curious
Right.
what drives it really.
So there are many things that will drive it, but a major factor that we see that drives it is what happens over an individual's lifetime. And this is why I said that we don't want a single number. We want a number for every year or so of an individual's lifetime. And what we can see is that particularly for women who have children or other care responsibilities, that this gap widens every year after she has children. And that is a key, I think, hint about what is going on.
I've heard you refer to this as couple inequity,
Right.
and couple inequity as a driver of gender inequity. Can you say more about that?
Sure. So let me say that we should first step back and consider various gender gaps, because we shouldn't just consider the gender pay gap. So gender gaps have narrowed in just about every aspect, economic and social aspect of life over time. So employment, labor force participation, education, professional degrees, even time spent taking care of children, lots of different things, including gender gaps in earnings. So, of course, two series can narrow but not become equal. A lot remains, and that's really what you want to know about. So the gender gap in earnings and in employment and labor force participation, in hours of work, and all of this is part and parcel of what we're trying to look at. They are still substantial, and some part of that, especially for the more educated, is due to what I've termed greedy work and the choices that couples make. The fact that if you have couple equity, you have less gender inequality, and if you have couple inequity, you have more gender inequality. So this gets into the notion of greedy work.
What can you define greedy work?
Sure. So greedy work exists when working more hours. Let's say you work twice the number of hours, and if that increases your implicit hourly wage by more than twice. And so greedy work can be defined as a job that pays disproportionately more on a per hour basis. Let's say when someone works a greater number of hours or has less control over those hours. So it could be that it's a rush job, it's a demanding client that calls at, 10 p.m., 11 p.m. It could be a supervisor who asks that the worker give up a vacation for the project. So what it means for the couple is that a couple with care responsibilities such as children or other care responsibilities would be financially better off by having a little bit of specialization. One member would take a more flexible job that would be less remunerative and be able to give the care, be able to be the person who's on call at home. And the other one is taking the job that is less flexible, the greedy job, and that's the one who's going to be on call at the office, and that's the more remunerative job. Now, they both could have taken the flexible job, but then they would have been leaving a lot of money on the table. And the degree to which the greedy job pays a lot more, it means they're being enticed to have a certain amount of specialization, even if they desperately wanted a 50-50 relationship, they would see that they would have to pay a certain amount for it.
And so when you talk about specialization, you're talking about it in terms of inside this couple, one person is the big money maker and that's their specialization inside the world of that couple, and the other person is the person who has more flexibility and may assume more of the care responsibilities. That's the kind of specialization you mean, is it?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
both of them are lawyers, and one works in the Park Avenue firm and is expected to jump when everyone says jump. And the other one is a lawyer who's working in a more boutique firm, and there's a team. And if one of the lawyers can't be on a case, the others step in for that person. And it's a more flexible job.
And ultimately, potentially pays less.
It definitely pays less. That's why one was on Park Avenue.
Yeah, that's right. So, this idea of couple inequity, what does it look like, for instance, when we start to look at this through the lens of potentially same-sex couples? Or, like, I'm curious about that, how that starts to shape the gender wage gap, if it does.
If we had more same-sex couples and if we had enough data, we'd be able to answer the question. My guess is that, and from same-sex couples that I know, that for some of them it works the same way, that there's no reason why they would be treated differently. They might then change what they do in the following way, that it may be that their specialization would be one way in one set of years and one way in another. There was a wonderful story about two women. One had a baby in year one and one had a baby 5 years later, and they switched. That would be a wonderful thing to do, but it's often the case that that isn't done, and the reason it's not done is because the individual who's been working at the Park Avenue firm has gotten used to it, and the firm has promoted the individual, and it would be very hard then to sort of switch. But we do have a sense, I can't say that we have the data, that same-sex couples might value the 50-50 relationship more and might be willing to pay more for it. And so even though there's an enticement to have this specialization, they might resist it a bit more, but we don't have the data. I would say we need more same-sex couples and we need better data.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've also been curious about is even when there is a couple inequity inside, so for instance, if you have a heterosexual relationship, what we see certainly, and I bet the data backs me up, but I'm not sure, if you would back me up on this, but what I have observed is that often in heterosexual couples, what I continue to see now among my friends and peers is that most often it is the woman who is taking the flexible job and her male partner takes the greedy job. Not all the time, but certainly I see this more often. And so my sense is that in a same-sex couple, you could still have couple inequity, but it doesn't actually drive the gender wage gap the same way that happens inside a heterosexual couple.
That would be the next statement that I would have had, and you said
Oh,
it.
interesting.
So that's
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
Right. So it would be the case that in a different sex couple, we have an added factor, which is that a set of social norms is driving the woman to be the one who takes the less remunerative, flexible position, and the man is taking the more remunerative, greedy position. And then what happens is that if you then have couple inequity, you're throwing gender equality under the bus. And so for every couple that does that, they increase gender inequity within their household and in the entire market as well. For same-sex couples, it doesn't move in exactly that direction. However, because we have same-sex women and same-sex men, we could also, between those, add gender inequities in the labor market that are more complicated. And since we don't have the data, we don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, fair. So one of the things that I'm curious about, and this sort of gets down to this idea of the relative cost of flexibility. And so I'm curious if you can define what you mean by that, because I've heard you talk about that before, this idea of the relative cost of flexibility, which is a very economicsy thing to say, but I'm curious if you can define it for our listeners. It's an interesting concept.
Well, in this case, we have a job that is asking an individual to do more. It's the greedy job. And so the individual is working harder and is getting paid more. Now, the flexible job is paying less. But the question is, why is the flexible job paying less? And can we do anything to up the productivity of individuals in that flexible job? So the flexible job is paying less because the notion is that individuals are important in their position, and if we have better substitutes for them, then we might be able to lower the cost of this flexibility. So let me move into something that we know a bit about, which is how the price of flexibility has changed due to the pandemic and remote work. Mm-hmm. So we're not certain yet exactly where this is going, but it's a good example. Let's say that we had a job that was a greedy job and that individuals in it were expected to travel every other week somewhere. Well, if that were the case, there were lots of people who wouldn't be able to take it. We would have to pay individuals more to take it. That then brings it in the realm of the high-paying, greedy jobs. But let's say that we've learned in the pandemic that you don't have to go to Tokyo to do the M&A, and you don't have to go to Zurich to sign the contract, or to Paris, or to London, or to San Francisco. Well, then the individual who needs to be home on weekends would be able to take that job. So what we've done is we have made the greedy job more flexible, or we've taken the flexible job and we've made it more productive. We've essentially lowered the price of flexibility. And lowering the price of flexibility can be along these lines, or it could be that individuals have good substitutes for each other. So that's another way in which we would lower the price of flexibility.
This concept that you just mentioned of substitutability is interesting because from what I understand, that also has a role in terms of which types of careers are we more likely to see a bigger gender wage gap potentially than in others. So I guess I'll start there. Are there places where, or careers or industries where you are more likely to see a broader gender wage gap than in others?
And the answer is yes. So there are occupations and professions in which it would be claimed there are few substitutes for the person, and sometimes that is true, or it's created and it's not really true, and it might be a reason why we might be able to get rid of it. And those are the occupations that have the greediest jobs. So they would be in finance, they would be in banking, they would be in law. But there have been many changes in other fields. And by the way, one of the fields in which there are generally sort of good substitutes for individuals, or in which individuals can work independently, are many of the tech jobs. And those are jobs in which the cost of flexibility is actually much lower. But there have been changes, and there are various professions that have formed groups, group practices, for example, that have enabled flexibility. And there are other jobs, and I have a chapter in my book about pharmacists, which is a very interesting example.
Can you share that example? The pharmacist
Sure,
example?
sure. So some occupations have changed because the individuals in them have demanded changes, and I'll talk about those. But some changes have occurred because they've been sort of organic. They've come from other forces, and the example of pharmacists is one of them. So there was a time, and it wasn't all that long ago, when a pharmacist would own his own business. He might hire another pharmacist as an assistant or may have a large number of them. Some of them would be women. Although there are women who own pharmacies, generally women did not own the pharmacy. But the woman who worked for the man who owned the pharmacy would earn far less than he did, largely because he owned the company. He was the residual claimant, and he would be the one who took on the risks and the time commitment of ownership. He had the greedy job. But then what happens? Changes then began to occur in the 1970s that decreased the fraction of independently owned pharmacies and led to the rise of the corporate model that we associate with CVS and Walgreens and Rite Aid, and the list can go on. And pharmacists became extremely good substitutes for each other through various forces, through the standardization of drugs. It wasn't as if you were going to a particular pharmacist who knew how to compound something that you wanted. And it also occurred because of an elaborate use of information technologies. It doesn't matter which pharmacy you go to, that pharmacist will know what other drugs you are taking and be able to counsel you about what might interact with the drug that you are currently being prescribed. So pharmacists then no longer receive the financial rewards or have the time demands of ownership. And the gender earnings gap for hourly earnings in pharmacy is one of the lowest among the higher paying occupations, even though a substantial fraction of female pharmacists work part-time at some point in their career. So that's a great example of an occupation that changed sort of organically from not one factor, from actually three separate factors. But a different set of reasons for change can be found in some of the medical professions. Let's take pediatrics. Many pediatricians, independent of gender, want flexibility. They want flexibility because they want to spend time with their own children, because they spend time with other people's children. And to do that, they have formed group practices that enable them to better choose their own schedules. At the same time, their clients, who are, let us say, 100% children, could get to know various pediatricians in the group. And that means that the children and their parents will be less upset if the doctor they see today is not the one they saw, last week when they had another boo-boo. So in this case, physicians are happier and their patients are happier. And the same set of changes occurred in veterinary medicine. When I go to the veterinarian with my pooch, I don't necessarily expect to see the same veterinarian, and he doesn't care if he sees the same veterinarian. He just cares whether they give him something to eat.
That's right. That's his ulterior motive.
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why veterinary medicine has become a female-dominated occupation, whereas in 1970 there were, about 5% of veterinarians were women, whereas today schools of veterinary medicine, it's about over 75%.
Huh. So is it fair to say that there's something in this idea of forming some form of a collective that creates that opens up more possibility or option for substitutability and therefore flexibility?
Absolutely. We think about teams. It's a very interesting word because the word teams would seem to imply that every team has the same characteristics. But there are teams of substitutes, as in pediatrics, and then there are teams of complements, as in consulting. So in consulting, we might be on a team, but I might be the economist, and you might be the financial expert, and someone else might be the engineer, and someone might be the architect, and someone might be the person who knows the languages in the various countries. And so if we have to work together, we're not substituting for each other. We're working together, and we might all have to be at the meeting at 11 a.m. on Thursday, and that is destructive of flexibility rather than enabling of flexibility.
And that's fascinating because I just put together the link too with this idea of specialization, that in some ways specialization is also destructive of flexibility, because in a team like that, you have a group of specialists.
That's precisely right. Yep.
Yeah. Fascinating. I want to just bring in the body of research that you have been working on, and so it's we have talked about it in the intro, which I will record later, which is all which focuses on your book Career and Family. And I would love if you can briefly touch on the research in that book, because one of the things that many of our listeners, I think many modern feminists will feel, and it's certainly something that I hear a lot, progress is so slow. Things haven't changed. They're not changing. But when we read the facts, when we read the research, they've actually changed enormously in quite a rapid amount of time. But I would love for you to kind of take us through that research. I'm not even sure how it got started, actually, how you started this project, but I'd love to hear a little bit about it and the groups of women that you studied.
Certainly. So one of the reasons that I wrote the book is to convey exactly what you just said, that we always are in one spot at a time, and we think that what we're observing and feeling is the way the world always was. And of course, it wasn't the way the world always was. It still may be that there are many individuals who would say change is still too slow. And we can talk about why change has been so slow. But what I do in the book is I ask what happened to different groups, generations, cohorts of women, and I focus specifically on college women because I'm trying to understand the degree to which they've been able to achieve both career and family. And I think about career not as a job, but career is a profession, is a position that we have through our lifetimes, that we grow with. It's not necessarily something we have to work at every year, but I think of it as something that becomes part of our identity. Family as well is something that becomes part of our love and our joy and our identity. And I think about that as, in fact, when I measure it as whether a woman has had a child or has adopted a child. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only way of thinking about it. And one can think about it in lots of different ways, but it is a useful way to think about it. So I look at generations of women who graduated college from around the year 1900 to the present and ask, how have they been able to achieve career and family? And what's interesting is that the first generation graduating in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, about 50% of them never had a child, about a third never got married. So you can see that they're not going to have a very high probability of having career and family, but many of them, the ones who didn't have kids, who didn't get married, were able to have careers. So there were enormous barriers and roadblocks in the way. And then as we continue, I'll fly over group 2 and go to group 3, which is as different from group 1 as you can imagine, because this is a group that's graduating college from the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s. They are the mothers of the baby boom.
Like my grandmother. I thought about this when, my grandmother. Yeah.
And so about over 90% of them ever marry. And of that group, about 90% have kids. So you have an extraordinarily, they're the mothers of the baby boom for a good reason. But it isn't as if they completely give up having a position, a job, or a career. They put family first, both in terms of what they want and the period of time in which they'll do it. And then they later, when the kids grow up, leave home often, have a job or a career. And in fact, their labor force participation rates when they're in their early 40s are around 75%. So they're quite high. So this is the group that Betty Friedan wrote about, that they were frustrated women stuck with the feminine mystique. And it may have been the case that they were in their own household jails for a period of time, but they had also set down their escape route. So Friedan, in some sense, either didn't see that or it wasn't useful for her to see that, and we should be grateful for the book that she wrote. But in fact, as a historian, we can look back and see that these women actually did make enormous progress, even though to Friedan they were regressive. They were actually quite progressive. And then, so you can see this enormous difference between group 1 and group 3. But then almost instantly, we move into group 4, who graduated college from the late 60s to about 1980 or so. And they latch on to the idea that they can have career first. And they can do this because they can delay marriage and delay childbearing with the ability to have modern contraceptive methods, mainly the pill, but also other methods. And they are determined to have career. And they could see that the previous generation had family very easily. So they don't give it a second thought. And they jump into career. They jump into professional training. This is the first great increase in women, the fraction who are lawyers, who go to law school, who go to medical school, who go to all the other advanced degrees. MBA somewhat later, but still in this period. And they delay having children to have career. And they do have career to a great extent, but 27% of this group doesn't have children. And so they sort of forgot to have the kids. And the next generation, the final one that I talk about, which is group 5, looks at group 4. It's as if we have these groups, these cohorts, passing this baton from one to the other with its warnings and its advice, and looks back and says, I'm not going to make the same stupid mistake you made. I'm going to have career and I'm going to have family. They've continued to delay having family. They've continued to greatly delay getting married, if they do get married. But they have had a much higher fraction of career and family than any of the previous generations. Now, that said, even though they have done the best, they're still doing more like 40 or 50% of what the men are doing. And so the frustration and the statements that there isn't progress are understood, and yet there's been enormous progress.
It's like the days pass slowly, but the years pass quickly. When you think about how it feels when you're in it, it really does feel like there's not a huge amount of progress, but obviously there is. I'm curious, over time, I'm curious about when you think, so what do we do? What do we do about this? What has your research revealed to you about some of the most important levers we can pull if we were serious about eradicating the gender wage gap?
Yeah, so it's not just the gender wage gap. It's gender gaps in many different places. And remember that another part of the gender gap here is that men aren't enjoying their families as much. So there really is a mirror image here that if we have a couple, remember we talked about couple inequity. If we have couple equity, it may not be that every year each of them does the same thing. That's why it's not equality, it's equity. And so if we want to have more equity, there are 3 things that we might do. 2 are potentially possible, and 1 is a much heavier lift. So the 2 are the first one, which we've discussed already, which is reducing the price of flexibility. So if we reduce the price of flexibility, then we don't have the couple having to decide between having one flexible job and one greedy job. The flexible job becomes more productive. The greedy job becomes more flexible. The difference in the price between the 2 of them becomes less and less, and therefore the cost of having a 50-50 relationship, the cost of having couple equity becomes a lot lower. And we talked a bit about that. The second possibility is drive down the price of caregiving. And that could be with regard to little kids. It could be with regard to the older parents. We know that daughters, more than sons, take care of their parents. So there are 2 types of prices that we can deal with. The price of flexibility, the price of caregiving. The price of caregiving we keep on facing in America and then throw it off the table because it looks too expensive. In the Nordic countries and in France and in England and in Wales and Britain, these costs have come down. France is an interesting case. And so there's been a lot more subsidization of preschool and even child care. Now, the third...
I just a question on that.
Sure.
Have you seen, is it too soon to tell, or in these countries where they have successfully, through subsidization and so on, driven down the cost of childcare, have there been any changes or early indications of potentially a shift in the gender gap?
So remember that there are many gender gaps. So it used to be that in America, we could say that the labor force participation rate of women is the highest in the world. It has not been the highest in the world since the 1990s, okay? It is higher in almost every one of these other high-income OECD countries. However, many women work lower hours than U.S. women. So U.S. women, the ones who work, are still working high numbers of hours. In terms of gender gaps in earnings, that comparison is affected enormously by the fact that we in America just have greater inequality, period. So I would much rather think about our individuals working where they would like to work. Are they working in the jobs they would like to work? Are they employed at all? We have lower labor force participation rates than in many other countries, including France has exceeded the numbers in the U.S., whereas Canada, for example, has exceeded the numbers in the U.S. So there's something that we are doing wrong. And part of it is that the cost of caregiving is very, very high. Another part of it, which gets into a much bigger complication, is that we still have joint taxation.
Oh, that's the sexy topic.
Joint taxation.
So say more, joint taxation.
Well, it means that if you have two earners, and let's say that we always consider the man to make the first dollar, then if we have progressive taxation, which of course we do, and we're talking about a lot of the people we're talking about here make a lot of money, so then the woman's earnings are taxed at the marginal rate, which is going to be much higher. So if they were taxed not jointly, then each person's hours would be taxed at the rate for that individual rather than jointly. So that's why. So if you're in the mindset that the woman is the added worker, then and you're making a fair amount of money. So if the first individual makes, let's say, $150K a year, so we're talking about high levels, then if she makes $1, it gets charged at the marginal rate.
And so that's the third lever you're talking about.
No, the
taxation.
Much bigger.
Because that's a huge
that could be changed, and it's been changed in other countries. I don't think of that as a big problem. The third lever is social norms. That's the
Right.
So if instead, going back to the same-sex couple, if in the same-sex couple, it didn't matter which one of them gave up their job for the flexible job, it wouldn't have mattered in terms of the gender difference in their earnings. Right. So if you just have a coin flip for a different sex couple, then it also wouldn't matter. So that would be a world in which you would have couple inequity, but not gender inequality. Now, I worry about couple inequity because I think that it would be nice for everyone to see their child take its first step, or say its first word, or hit its head on the wall or the bathtub the first time, or any of the joys or problems of being a parent.
This is fast. Okay, so I want to just briefly recap because what you're saying, what your research has revealed about some of the key levers that we can move, that we can start to ask for or advocate for, are so different than what we see in the culture. So, for instance, adopting a gender lens in hiring practices, or making sure that people have sensitivity training, and there's all kinds of things that we talk about, making sure that there are sort of double-blind interviews, and there's many different things that we talk about to potentially reduce the gender wage gap. And it's not that these things aren't important or real or addressing very real problems, as you were very clear to point out at the top of the interview. But really, when we're looking at the core things, let's say we addressed a lot of these discrimination and harassment. Based on what I'm hearing, that would have potentially only an incremental impact on the gender wage gap.
Small. That's right. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And I am someone who did one of the early studies on double-blind auditions.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I did the orchestra study.
Oh, my gosh. Really? That's what I was... I didn't know that was you.
Yep. Huh. That was me and Cecilia Rouse, who is now the head of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Huh. Yeah. And so as devastating as that was, as devastating as the results of that study were, it would still just be a small part of the puzzle. I'm curious about when you talked about reducing the price, and when you talked about driving down the price of caregiving. That makes sense to me. That's certainly something that we can use, public measures potentially, or subsidization to do. The taxation, I guess, which would be part of that, driving down the cost of caregiving, but reducing the price of flexibility. What does that look like? So the math would work, but I'm curious about the types of initiatives that you might see, or how we might look at things differently that would reduce actually the price of flexibility.
So I'm not advocating a government intervention here, if that's what you're asking about. I don't see...
No, I'm just curious about how it would be done.
Well, I gave you a couple of examples, many examples. So you're in a firm, workplace, and individuals are expected to, take on certain clients, and you see that, that it's you're 6 months pregnant, and you know that you're not going to be there for the client in a couple of months, but you have an individual in the firm who you work with, and you're going to share. You're going to go back and forth, just like in that boutique law firm I was just talking about. And so it's a different way of organizing the firm so that individuals are not indispensable, but at the same time are still important. Let me give you an example. So someone might say in response to this, "Oh, I'm a lawyer, I don't want to be a commodity. I'm a financial wizard, I don't want to be a commodity." And I would say to them, "Do you have any children?" They'd say, "Sure." I would say, "Was the child brought into this world by an obstetrician?" They would say, "Sure." I said, "Well, your wife and you went to see 3 obstetricians, because it wasn't necessarily the case that the one that you might have wanted an epsilon more would be there at that point." They say, "Sure, they were substitutes for each other." I'd say, so it's perfectly okay to be a substitute bringing a child into this world, but not testifying on a case. Oops.
Touché. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is a new area of your work, and we're sort of looping back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is the very long-term consequences of the gender wage gap, and how it starts to sort of potentially can open up a chasm over time. When we think about not just lifetime earnings, but what happens when you take that flexible job that also comes at a cost. So my understanding is that you are doing research with women who are over 40, in their 40s and 50s, and really exploring this idea: is it possible to kind of lean in and catch up? I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what this study is and any preliminary findings that you're seeing thus far.
Sure. So we have data that goes back to a large group of individuals who were interviewed first when they were about 20 years old in 1979. So they are now in their 50s. And so we know everything about them, or at least everything that they have to tell us. And so we jumped into using these data to ask, when the children grow up and go through hit various milestones, and these milestones have changed over time. So when I was a kid, the milestone was often, when the kid graduated from junior high school, and then it became when the kid entered kindergarten, and now it's actually earlier. So there are many different milestones, And each of these milestones might mean that the care for that child, unless the child has special needs, that care, certain aspects it would be shed. And so we asked, when the children grow up and at some point leave home, when are the moments that women can work more hours, shift into more demanding jobs, and possibly commute longer distances? Of course, we're now in a world in which sometimes commuting longer distances is not that important. And so what we have seen is that we do see small amounts of catch-up, but not as many as we had thought. But what we do see is that there is a stemming of the loss, that women were losing out to individuals who are similar to, if they are different sex, in a different sex relationship, to their husbands. But we don't see as much catch-up. And the way to think about it is really to think about a race. So if two people are racing and one person stops or slows down, the other person is going to get really significantly ahead. In addition, the person who's gotten ahead has gained more experience and is simply better. So it's going to take a lot to catch up. And so women may not for a while. So it's one thing to say lean in. The question is, how much are you going to be leaning in? But we do know in some other work that I've done that has looked at women who are over the age of 55, that women have been working a lot more in their 60s and even their 70s. And many women are working even when their husbands, who are actually older than they are on average, are retired. And so if we think back to the groups that I talked about in my book, so group 4, graduating college in the 1970s, is this group. They are the women who early on latched on to a career, had it as part of their identity. Many had kids, and they are the ones who have decided to sort of continue this even into their older ages. So even though they lost out on part of the marathon when they were younger, they're still in the race, and some of the guys are sitting on the sidelines giving them the cups of water. So to my disappointment in looking at the numbers, we didn't see as much catch up as we thought we would. We certainly see women working more hours, but at least for this group of women, and remember that this group was about 20 in 1979, so they were born around from the late 50s to the early 60s. And so hopefully the younger group that we haven't yet studied will be able to push on and, as you said, lean in and get more out of it. This group, it appears, has stemmed the loss. We know that, as I said, for older women, they are staying in the race, but we haven't yet done what we had hoped we would.
What you're sharing about the research reminds me of this experience I had with my mom, who was in group 4. So I'm in group 5 and she was in group 4. And so she had a career and then she had family. And also because we immigrated to a different country and very different culture and so on. So she stayed home with us. But I can remember I've just graduated from university and I'm thinking about what I'm going to do for my career. And she was extremely pragmatic. in that she was extremely pragmatic, giving the opposite advice of Lean In, of Sheryl Sandberg, who said, forget about it until you have to worry about it. My mother really advised me to think about creating a career where I would have the opportunity to be able to have a big job, as big as I wanted it to be, but also to create flexibility, which was actually what drove me toward entrepreneurship. There's not as much substitutability, so we're working on that piece of it, but it's really interesting seeing the sort of tableau of research and just seeing hints of that kind of playing out. And I know that so many of the people who are listening will have stories like that, where that was my grandmother. Yeah, that's exactly, what happened. And that was my mom. And now this is me. So I want to thank you so much for the research and for shedding, I think, some light on some of the pervading myths and stereotypes we have around what the gender wage gap is and why it exists. I really do appreciate it. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have, or that you feel is important to mention in the context of this conversation and the themes that came up?
No, and I enjoyed hearing about your family as well.
Yeah, thank you.